Hi everyone and welcome to Dennis Deep Cuts, the 53rd installment of this fine YouTube series. Today we're talking about 90s hardcore. Again, let's see what happens. 2 weeks ago I did an episode where I unboxed the new Abinanda record box set and I talked about 90s Umeå hardcore, and then I said maybe I should do an episode about my favorite 90s hardcore records. So here we are. And if you notice, it has been 2 weeks, and I think this is what's going to happen moving forward. I want this channel to be a joy, not a chore. And busting out one episode a week is a lot of work, and I am currently busy writing for not one, not two, but 3 albums. So I want to have some time to do that as well, and I want to keep on creating good content for you. So basically, that's why. If something comes up, I might do an extra episode here and there, but every other week. And I know there are plenty of episodes you haven't checked out yet. I know there's some episode that no one has checked out, so go back and do that. If you're waiting for me to put out a new episode, just go back and look at that episode you never checked out already. So please do. Making a list of my 10 favorite 90s hardcore records was not an easy task. I thought it was going to be, but it was way more difficult than I thought it was, because I wanted to create this list as a list of records that I would listen to now and that I would recommend to other people that holds up on their own. And it's really hard to detach myself from how I felt back then and the bands I used to love back then and the scene that I was a part of. Because a lot of how we listen to music is tied up in things like that, like nostalgia, or you were there, you saw that band live and they were awesome, they were my favorite band. But I wanted to listen to it with fresh ears and sort of dive in. And it does mean there are a couple albums that was hugely important for me in the 90s that did not make the cut. It also means there are a couple of records here that maybe I didn't give them enough of time in the 90s. When I listen to them now, I'm like, holy shit, this needs to be on the list. So it is very special. One of these days, I might make a list of the records that meant the most to me in the 90s. And that's going to be a very different list from the list that I'm presenting you today. These are, as of today, the top 10 hardcore albums of the 90s. And another thing that I wanted to do was, if I would make a list of my favorite 90s record, it would obviously look very, very different. But when I talk about 90s hardcore, I wanted to talk about 90s hardcore. There are plenty of bands adjacent to that world, or sort of on the fringes of that scene, that you got your Quicksands, or one of my favorite bands, Into Another, and you have Fugazi, you have Bikini Kill. That might be my top 10 list of albums of the 90s, like 6 Fugazi records and 2 Bikini Kill records. But I wanted this to be very specific to the scene, the world, the ideology, and I guess the fashion of 90s hardcore. So a lot of stuff that would be on my top 10 best list of 90s music is not going to make it, but rather focused on that 90s hardcore world and scene that we were part of with Refused. And another thing that was tricky, because in my mind I had a pretty decent idea about what I wanted it to be. But then when I started digging in, I mean, the 90s by no means were a homogeneous scene. There's so many little worlds happening. There's so many different subcultures. So a lot of the more punky stuff that was, for me, really important didn't really make the list. That might be another list. Generally speaking, 90s hardcore, you had like the metal tinged hardcore, slightly preppy world, and you had a really punky, super political, screamo, emo, noisy world. And for me, that second world was really important. When I was obviously one of those guys that I loved Snap Craze and Earth Crisis and Strife, but then when everybody else started liking them, I started liking the noisy, weird political stuff, because that's just kind of the fucking weirdo that I was. Maybe that I am. But as important as that music was for me in the 90s, a lot of it doesn't hold up. And I wanted this list to be a list of bangers, of albums that I would put on and I would recommend to people. So there's some big holes, and as an OCD type of person, that's quite frustrating. When I started to piece together this list, I was like panicking, and I'm like, well, I need that, and then I need these songs, and I need these records, and you know, it's quite stressful. The last caveat that I'd like to throw out there is that some of my favorite hardcore of the 90s were 7 inches. My favorite hardcore record of the 90s is the Inside Out 7-inch. But that's a 7-inch. It's not going to make the cut. And I love the Burn 7-inch. And there's a whole slew of great 7-inches that if they would have been an album, they would have been on top of the list. But they weren't. So I'm going to focus on albums. And there's a couple of EPs thrown in here as well. But that's what I'm going to focus on. Sorry about rambling. This was way more important to me than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be one of those, like, yeah, I'll just throw some 90s hardcore together. But I've spent like a good 2 weeks really thinking about this. And the list has changed so much from day to day. And there's even some records of, oh, it's going to make the record, you know, it's going to make the cut. But I didn't have the vinyl version of it, because I maybe only had the CD version of it. Such as Acme from Germany. They're one of the coolest and weirdest, noisiest hardcore bands in the 90s. I don't have that vinyl version of their 7-inch. That made no sense. Anyway, let's dig into 90s hardcore, the scene, the world that we were a part of, and let's see what happens. One of the things that I thought was exciting about being a part of this 90s scene is that, you know, we came out and we started playing shows, and we met all these other bands, and we were part of the world that was happening and that was evolving in front of our eyes. Our generation of people were the first generation that started hardcore bands based on the fact that we grew up with hardcore bands. A lot of the early 80s hardcore people, they grew up with punk and other type of music, and it reflected in their music. But as the 80s progressed, and a lot of us, you know, discovered punk and hardcore in the late 80s, early 90s, we grew up listening to just punk and hardcore. And in the early 80s, you had hardcore, you had punk, and you had metal. And then in the mid 80s, crossover became a thing. And it was kind of its own genre. But then in the late 80s to early 90s, hardcore started really messing with metal. But at first it was just like a little tinge of metal, like your bands like Judge and stuff like that, that like used really heavy riffs in other fast-paced hardcore. And by the time we're in the early 80s, a lot of bands started using the metal thing to great effect. And I mean, I was in a band that worshipped Slayer. We still worship Slayer, and I'm still in that band, but you know what I mean. And it was interesting because to be part of that scene was to be part of something contemporary that was happening. We were not looking backward, seeing like, oh, we want to be this or we want to be that. We wanted to create something new, and that was super exciting. And one band that was widely important stylistically and musically to a lot of us was, of course, Unbroken, Life, Love, Regret on 10th place. Unbroken from San Diego, they put out 2 full-length albums, and Life, Love, Regret was one of those templates for a lot of hardcore people in the mid-90s to mix that balance between metal and punk and hardcore, and due to great effect, a lot of metal-y guitar and screaming vocals, but it also had lyrics that were a bit different than usual punk subject matter. I think this record is pretty awesome. It's definitely, and this, don't take this the wrong way, it's definitely musically not as impressive now as it was in 1994 when I first heard it. That being said, it's still a great record, and that's what we're judging it on. It's still a great record today. But the impact of this record was massive, and people really loved it. I got to say that they put out a 7-inch after this record. That's some of the best 90s hardcore I ever heard. If they put out a LP sounding like that, that would be like top 3. Unbroken broke up, and one of the guys killed himself. But then they got back together, and they're frequently playing shows, not that often. If you want to check out one of the bands that really defined that metal tinged sort of sound that I guess eventually became metalcore, I think Unbroken is a good starting point. It's a pretty kick-ass record. Speaking of metal, Integrity, Cleveland, Ohio, Systems Overload from 1995, I think. Integrity started in 1988. I really love the first record, For Those Who Fear Tomorrow, from 1991. I remember when we heard it the first time, we were quite blown away by its blend of really aggressive metal mixed with punk and hardcore. I think Systems Overload is a bit more well-defined. The production is a bit better. And it's just an all-around pretty kick-ass record. Integrity is still around. The singer Dwid's like the main cat that's held this band together for all those years. He relocated to Belgium like 20 years ago, and they still put out records that are raw and violent and aggressive and metal mixed with punk and industrial music, and it's just pretty awesome. So if you want your hardcore to sound like metal or your metal to sound like hardcore, I think Integrity is a great band, and I always love his voice. His screaming voice is pretty fantastic. So the next record is one of those records I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to when it came out because I was in a different headspace. But now, going into 90s hardcore with open mind, I really, really like this record. I am talking about Philly's own Ink and Dagger's first record, The Fine Art of, whatever it's called, Fine Art of Original Sin, from 1998. You know, after Kiss and before Ghost, you had Ink and Dagger, and when they first came out in the mid-90s, they dressed up as vampires, and they had this whole mythos about them. And I really liked Ink and Dagger. I thought their first couple of 7-inches were fantastic, and they were a favorite band of mine. And in 1997, Don, that played guitar in Ink and Dagger, called me and he said, I heard Refuse is looking for a bass player. And I said, yes. And he said, I got what it takes. So Don DeVore from Ink and Dagger flew up to Umeå to try out as Refuse bass player. And he wasn't really a bass player. He was a great guitar player, wasn't much of a bass player. And he was practicing with Chris and Dave for a couple of days. And then they said, I don't think this is going to work out. You're not the type of bass player we're looking for. But we really liked him, and we really liked each other. He stayed at my house for a couple of days. And then the next European tour we did, we brought Ink and Dagger along with us. And they were so much fun to tour with. It was quite chaotic, but a really fun tour. We played a show in London. We did a UK tour with Ink and Dagger. There was, you know, there's some awesome footage online from that tour, especially when we played in Ireland, where there's like no one at the show. The last song, Sean, the singer, fell and he hit his eyebrow on the monitor, and he had to go to the hospital. And we went up and we started playing, and it was like the only show of the UK tour that was kind of packed. And it was a small place, but it was packed. There was a lot of people there. And I think the second or third song, I did like a headbang, and Chris did something with his guitar. So his tuning peg hit me right here, and I started bleeding profusely all over stage, and that was the end of that show. And I also had to go to the hospital to get stitched up, and the venue was called the Red Eye, which I thought was quite humorous. I think when the record came out in 1998, I think I was a little bit, Refused might even have broken up by then, or we were on the verges of breaking up. And my attention laid elsewhere. I was into soul music. I was into like, mod stuff and whatever. And I didn't really pay a lot of attention. I mean, I bought the record. They were friends of mine. I really liked the band. And now when I listen to it, it's a fantastic record. It's experimental. It's quirky. It's wild. And even though the vampire mythos is not as prevalent as on the previous 7 inches, it still has a really cool, eerie quality about it. And this is a record that I really would recommend to anyone that's into like quirky post-hardcore type of stuff. There's a lot of weird influences on it. And it's just a fantastic record. Sadly, Sean killed himself in 2000, 27 years old. He was quite the character. I really, really enjoyed being on tour with him. Don DeVore, that didn't make the cut as the Refused Bass Player, went on to form a band called the Icarus Line, which the International Noise Conspiracy toured a couple of times with. And then I was in a band called Collapsing Senior, which is great. Ink and Dagger. They put out one more record on Buddyhead, but I think it came out right after they'd broken up. And basically, like, check out their 7 inches and check out their record, and it's something quite different. And I think they took like all the influences of 90s hardcore and put it together on a really, really cool record. On 7th place, we have a band that's very much not a 90s hardcore band. That's one of the things too. Like, I wanted to stay clear of bands, typical 80s hardcore bands that put out good records in the 90s. Such as Suicide Tendencies. I don't know if they're a hardcore band, whatever. But I wanted to stay clear of that and kind of focus on that 90s scene. But one of the bands that they formed in the mid-80s in New York, but they were really champions of 90s hardcore. And they always brought 90s, like the young and up-and-coming bands with them on tour. And they were one of the old-school hardcore bands that definitely thrived in the 90s. And I am, of course, talking about the excellent Sick of It All with their third album, Scratch the Surface. Sick of It All was part of like the 80s New York hardcore scene. They're one of the few bands that kind of transcended that and went past that. And even though they still had their old school kind of like fast hardcore stuff, like they evolved into the 90s and became like such a powerhouse of a band. Their first record, the Blood, Sweat, and No Tears, was massively important to me when I started my first band, Step Forward. Second record, Just Look Around, was fantastic. But I think on Scratch the Surface from 1993, it's everything that's fantastic about Sick of It All on one record. It's like hooky, it's fast, it has the perfect beatdowns and mosh parts, it has the slow mid-tempo punky songs, and it sounds fantastic, and their playing is peak. I think that Built to Last from 1997 was also a really good record. And then I gotta say, Sick of It All just continued up until now just to put out solid records. It's not like, I don't think Sick of It All will ever put out a record that surprises you, but they'll always put out, none of their record will disappoint you if you're into Sick of It All. But yeah, Sick of It All was one of those bands, like, they brought Snapcase on tour with them. They were always touring with these young bands, and they were super cool about it. And they were one of those bands that just like, all through the 90s, they were just fantastic, and they were a fantastic live band. I remember 1992, me and a couple of guys from Refused traveled down to the Hultsfred Festival to see Sick of It All play live. And even though the stage was way too big for them, they did not disappoint. And since then, I've been lucky enough to tour with Sick of It All and play a bunch of shows with them and hang out with them quite a lot. Actually, Refused brought Sick of It All along on an Australian tour a couple of years back, which for me to have Sick of It All opening up for me was, it's just wrong. It's just wrong. But they're such professionals, and they're such rad, awesome dudes. And I cannot recommend Sick of It All enough. Like, pretty much anything in the catalog you can check out, but Scratch the Surface might be the perfect starting point of a fantastic 90s hardcore record. And speaking of Sick of It All, the next band Number 6 on the list, the first time I saw them, they opened up for Sick of It All in Gothenburg in 1993. Me and a couple of friends traveled down to see them play in front of 20 people, and we became friends. And I am, of course, talking about Snapcase from Buffalo, New York. You know, the importance that Snapcase has had on Refused, I mean, it's not to be underestimated. They brought us on tour in Europe in 1995. They brought us on tour in the States in 1996. They also brought Donuts on their US tour in 1995. And they're true champions and true friends until 1996, when they brought us on tour in the States, and Refused was right in the middle of our "we are the most political band in the world," and I just discovered like the screamo emo noise nonsense music, and we were kind of being dicks about it. Our whole mission to go to the States was sort of subvert everyone's ideas about what hardcore is supposed to be, and we wanted to be super political and radicals, and Snapcase just wanted to have a good time. They just wanted to be on tour and play music, and here we are, and we were quite ungrateful and idiotic. That being said, they were fantastic. They're one of those bands, like from the first time I saw them until the last time I saw them, which was only a couple of years ago in Canada, maybe, well, now it's more than a couple of years ago, but they've always been such a consistently fantastic live band. And I think that really sort of upped our level as a band. Like every time we play with Snapcase, we're like, well, you know, can't let them blow us off stage. I mean, they did 95% of the time, they did blow us off stage, but it really kept us on our toes. And also the way they riffed, it was something quite inspiring. Progression Through Unlearning from 1997 is a perfect, like mid-tempo, riff-o-rama masterpiece. I think that their guitar playing and the groove that this record have is it's just fantastic. I think that when it came out in 1997, I wasn't paying that much attention. I like the Caboose. The first song is probably the best Snapcase song ever written. And Designs for Automotion Designs for Automotion from 1999. Is equally good and equally fantastic. It's a quite experimental record. Snapcase kept putting out great music until they broke up in 2005. And I mean, they're one of those bands that they play shows every once in a while. This is a record that is truly fantastic. Looking Glass Cell from 1993, I think at that point was more important to us because it came at the right place at the right time. And we truly love that record, but I think this is a much more powerful record, and I think the riffage on this record is just fantastic. Snapcase, thank you so much for bringing us on tour all those times, and I am sorry that we were kind of assholes. What can I say? I'm sorry. Not a whole lot of European hardcore made this list. Not a whole lot of Swedish hardcore made this list, but there's one band that is number 5 and probably one of the best Swedish hardcore bands of all time. I am, of course, talking about Breach with their 1997 record, It's Me, God. Breach started in Luleå. It's 3 hours north of Umeå. And quite influential in ways that you wouldn't expect. But when Breach started, the singer Thomas had this really powerful screaming voice. And even when they made their first demo tape, he had this really fine-tuned screaming voice. It's quite impressive. So when we did the second Refused demo, Breach just started. I think they had maybe a demo out. No, I'm lying. When we did their first Refused EP, this is the new deal. We came to the studio in Luleå, where we recorded the first couple of demos. And Pelle, the producer, said, you're not gonna sing like a wimp, are you? I think you should scream like Thomas does in Breach. And it pushed me to scream, and it made me the screamer that I am today. And Breach and Pele is really responsible for that, which is quite exciting. We toured with Breach a couple of times. They were magnificent. They're one of those bands that just defied everything. They're dark, pummeling, noisy, aggressive. After a couple like decent metal hardcore tinged albums, the third record is just like a different category on its own. It's like kind of hardcore, but it's really indebted a lot to Neurosis and that whole really noisy post-hardcore, post-noise music kind of thing. And this record is just a pummeling experience. Not a whole lot of sing-alongs, not a lot of hits, but it's just one of those records that just pulls you in and overwhelms you with this massive riffs and massive ideas. And yeah, one of the best Swedish hardcore albums of all time, I gotta say. And I'm incredibly happy that we got to tour with these guys and got to hang out with them quite a lot. And you know, I still run into a couple of these guys whenever I'm up in Luleå, because some of them still live there. So Breach, what a band. They put out 2 more records after this. They're both also really demanding, but in the right way, and they were just a marvelous band. So number 4, this is cheating a little bit because I said no EPs, but this is an EP, but it's such a fantastic EP, and it's a 12-inch. So let's go ahead and put it on the list, shall we? Statue from California, released in 1993, Filter the Infection. Statue was a short-lived band, people from Chain of Strength and Inside Out. And this is just fantastic. It reminds me a lot of like the mid-late 80s emo scene in DC, Rites of Spring, Gray Matter, but updated to a little bit of a thick, fat production and a touch of metal, but it's very melodic, and all 4 songs are fantastic. I love the guitar work, I love the singing, I love the general playing, and it's one of those bands I wish they put out a full-length record. It probably would have been my favorite full-length records of the 90s, but we'll have to do with these 4 songs that are just truly, truly outstanding. So it's Statue's one of those bands I don't understand why not more people are talking about how great this EP is. So heading into top 3, as I said in the start, I wanted to keep this focused on that sort of the our world, our scene. There's a lot of other cool 90s hardcore out there that could probably make be its own list. I'm talking about, of course, first of all, I'm talking about all the screamo, emo, noisy, violent stuff, such as, you know, bands like Mouse Icon or Universal Order of Armageddon or Antioch Arrow, or, you know, bands like that. Heroin, fucking fantastic. There's also those bands that I didn't even touch upon. And then you have, you know, the importance of like political bands like such as Los Crudos, that's just fantastic, and Struggle and Downcast, and there's so much cool music of the 90s. Some of it maybe not musically stood the test of time, but it was important, it was fascinating, and it was interesting. That might be another list. I wanted to keep this focused on kind of our world a little bit. Yeah, just a little disclaimer. For those of you like, where is that Heroin 12-inch? It's right here in this pile over here when I try to figure out what records to put on this list. All right, number 3. a controversial pick, maybe, possibly. It's 108's Holy Name from 1993. 108 is the brainchild of Vic DiCara. Used to play in a New York hardcore band, Beyond. And then he was in the best hardcore band of the 90s, Inside Out, together with Zack from Rage Against the Machine. And then he joined the Krishna hardcore band Shelter. Did not make the list today. And then he started his own band, 108. It was a Krishna core outfit. They put out a bunch of great records. I know a lot of people really like Songs of Separation, their second record. But I love Holy Name because it's chaotic. It's intense. It's a bit wild. What it feels like on Songs of Separation, their second record, they have their idea much more focused. But I like the fact that the first record it's a bit more intense and it's a bit more wild and sprawling. It's a little bit all over the place. Plus, Vic himself is singing on a lot of tracks on this one, and his voice is just honestly out of control in the best possible way. Hare Krishna is weird, and Hare Krishna might deserve a full episode of the fact that in the 90s you had hardcore bands that were Hare Krishnas, and then you had like, you know, tough guy gangs from New York, and then you had like these scrawny anemic emo kids rolling around on the floor. And it's kind of the palette of 90s hardcore. There's so much going on. And I thought it was fascinating that the width of the scene was so weird and everybody hated each other. Everybody was fighting with each other. It's quite wild. 108 was the first band that I went on a European tour with. They were really cool. Rob, the singer, was quite confrontational and quite wild. And them being Hare Krishnas and us being a bunch of like Swedish pinkos definitely made for some clashes. But them being Hare Krishnas also meant that a lot of promoters tried to stiff us on hotels. And they just said, like, well, you can stay at the Krishna temple. So my first European tour, I stayed at Krishna temple, so almost every night, which is really surreal experience. 108 went on to put out a whole bunch of really good records. I would say that pretty much everything in the catalog is great. Even they put out a record in the 2000s that is really good. Vic's guitar playing is really special, and their songwriting, how they structure the songs is really cool. And Rob has a nasty, violent voice that just, you know, demands your attention. Yeah, they're Hare Krishnas. It's a bit weird, but then in Cro-Mags were Hare Krishnas. Look at them; they're completely normal people. 108 Holy Name, number 3 on my 90s hardcore list. Yes. Number 2, 90s hardcore. Not an LP, a 10-inch. This is the worst format. One of these days we're going to talk about formats, and I think the 10-inch is almost worse than a CD. It's just impossible to have it in your collection if you're not going to get all the 10 inches in one spot. Whatever. Man Lift the Banner. I've talked about Man Lift the Banner before because they're one of the most important bands in my life, as far as like, you know, the political output and the ideas that they gave me. They're from the Netherlands. They put out 7-inch and then this 10-inch, and it's the best European hardcore of the 90s, hands down. Fast, aggressive, kind of old school, but it has a touch of like that 90s metal tinge to it. And songs about revolution and communism and feminism, and they were so important to my ideas. And it is interesting because It's not a nostalgia thing. The music holds up so well. The music is still fantastic. But you can't underestimate their importance as a band as well. Man Lifted the Banner, Crucial Response Record put out an album a couple years back with all their stuff plus a bunch of newly recorded songs. That's definitely worth checking out if you don't want to have a 10-inch in your collection. But yeah, Man Lifted the Banner, spot number 2. It's my favorite 90s hardcore record. I'm cheating a little bit here as well because it's not an album, it's a compilation album. 7 inches and different comp tracks. And it's also a band that wasn't really part of our world or part of our scene. First of all, they're a bit too early 90s. And second of all, they were different kind of mindset, and they were more from the squat punk kind of scene than we were. I am, of course, talking about Born Against. New York City, they started in 1988. I think they broke up in 91 or 92 already. This compilation is from 1995. Their 7 inches are fantastic. I talked about Born Against before because they are one of my favorite bands. Political, confrontational, funny, satirical, wild. You just look at some live footage on YouTube. It's pretty out there. They're fighting with everyone. They're fighting. They had beef with Sick of It All. They had beef with the Krishnas. They beefed with everyone, which was quite inspiring too. They're very fearless in their attitude, and they put out some of the best punk hardcore of all time, basically. Yeah, Born Against. And they were part of that whole Rorschach, Hell No, that really raw Citizen's Arrest. What a fucking band. This is impossible. There's too many good records that came out in the 90s. I thought this was going to be easy. I mean, some of it was easy, but it feels like I told myself that I wasn't going to make it like Dennis's complete breakdown of 90s hardcore, because that's just too much. But maybe one of these days I need to do a complete breakdown of 90s hardcore. Everything from like, all these different scenes and all these different ideas and all these different fashions. And one of these days, maybe. Not today. Born Against, number 1. Best 90s hardcore of all time. What is your pick? Do you agree with anything that I've said ever? Probably not. What's your favorite 90s hardcore album? Do you agree with my picks? What do you think I missed out on? Tell me in the comments below, and thanks for watching me rambling on about this. This was probably one of the most difficult episodes I ever had to do. No one forced me. I did all my own bullshit. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay well, my friends. Bye-bye.